Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the SFC seminar on management and disclosure of climate-related risks by fund managers. I'm Linda, Director of the Intermediary Supervision Department of the SFC, and with me are our senior managers, Winnie and Kelvin. Climate-related risks are increasingly cited as a major priority on the global agenda and needs to be urgently addressed. And given the increasing importance of climate change and sustainable finance, there has been a notable trend towards adopting reporting obligations for ESG and climate-related information. However, some reporting standards are voluntary in nature, and also there's a lack of consistency in the standards. Also, some corporates and fund managers may cherry-pick the information to be disclosed to the investors. And this may ultimately trigger the issue of greenwashing. Many jurisdictions have enhanced or have been enhancing ESG or climate-related disclosures. International organizations and standards setters, they are also gaining momentum to develop their standards. In August, the SFC has issued the amendments to the Fund Manager Code of Conduct, or the FMCC, and issued a circular setting out our expected standards for fund managers managing collective investment schemes to take climate-related risks into their consideration when they manage their portfolios, and also to make the appropriate disclosures. And to foster the development of a more consistent framework and to reduce the compliance burden of the industry, the SFC makes reference to the widely accepted, recognized TCFD recommendations, i.e. the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, when we develop our standards. But why SFC have commenced with an initial focus on climate change, but not all the ESG factors? Sustainable finance has covered various aspects, but focusing on climate change will make implementation more manageable, in particular when the matrix in this aspect are more developed. Also, climate change is regarded as a source of financial risk by the NGSF, i.e. the network of central banks and regulators for greening the financial system. And this falls squarely within the mandate of the regulators. So it's therefore considered appropriate to require the fund managers to take climate-related risks into account when they manage their investment process. And in today's seminar, we are going to cover the following areas. Firstly, the applicability of the requirements, implementation timeline, and then to explain what's the relevance and materiality of climate-related risks, and then to explain the requirements under the FMCC, as well as the baseline requirements and enhanced standards under our circular. So before the seminar, we have collected some questions from the Fund Managers Associations. We will try to address these questions during our presentation. So maybe let me pass to Winnie to explain our requirements.
Hi, hello everyone. So as Linda just mentioned earlier, as of August 20th this year, we've issued amendments to the Fund Manager Code of Conduct, FMCC, to set out the principal requirements, and we've also issued a circular to set out the expected standards in complying with the FMCC requirements. Just a few key points to note about the requirement. First of all, the requirements will be focusing on the climate-related risk at this initial stage. And secondly, only fund managers who are managing collective investment schemes, CIS, with investment discretions will be in scope at this stage. That means discretionary account management will be out of scope for this stage. And thirdly, as Linda mentioned as well, when setting out the requirements, we have made reference to the well-recognized TCFD recommendations. So therefore, our requirements also consist of 4 elements, that is including governance, investment management, risk management, and disclosures. And for disclosures requirement, it will only be applicable to fund managers who are responsible for the overall operation of a fund, that is ROOF.
So Winnie, where will a fund manager be considered as a ROOF?
Yeah, so in determining whether a fund manager is the party responsible for the overall operations of a fund, a fact-based review is necessary to ascertain whether in substance it is responsible for the day-to-day operations and management of the fund. So just to give the audience some examples, first of all, first example would be where the senior management or shareholders of a fund manager constitute a majority of the board of directors of a fund. And second example would be where the representative of the fund manager or its subsidiaries constitute a majority of the board of directors of the fund. And for our licensed corporation, if you would like to know further examples or detailed explanations, please refer to the answer to question 1 of the FAQ of the Fund Manager Code of Conduct. And of course, finally, the fourth thing that I want to highlight is that for the expected standards stated in the circular, we've actually adopted a 2-tier approach. What this essentially means is that we have a baseline requirement, as you can see on the left-hand side, covering the 4 elements which are applicable to all fund managers. That is covering governance, investment management, risk management, and the disclosures. And then on the right-hand side, you also see that we have the enhanced standards, which are additional requirements covering the areas of additional requirements on risk management and disclosures. And will only be applicable to what we call the large fund managers, which are those with the asset under manage of Hong Kong $8 billion or above of any 3 months in the previous reporting year.
So Winnie, how should fund managers calculate the 8 billion threshold?
Yeah, so fund managers will actually only need to include the asset under manage for the collective investment scheme funds where they have investment discretions over. Just to give you some examples, if the fund manager only have investment discretion to manage a portion of a CIS fund, then they will only need to include such portion of the asset under manage in their assessments of the Hong Kong $8 billion threshold. And just to, for the avoidance of doubt, just to clarify that the threshold of $8 billion does not include asset under manage for discretionary account management because at this stage, discretionary account management is out of scope. And there are 2 more things that I actually want to highlight. First of all, is that the requirements are not intended to single out climate-related risk from other investment risks, for example, market risk or liquidity risk. But rather, what we intend to do is to ensure our fund managers will properly consider climate-related risk during their investment and risk management processes. And if they are the ROOF, they will also make adequate disclosures to the investors. And the second thing I want to highlight is that the new FMCC climate requirements are applicable to all in-scope fund managers, regardless of whether they are managing SFC authorized funds or they're managing non-SFC authorized funds. So in order to determine the applicability of the requirements, we would recommend in-scope fund managers to consider the following 4 questions. So first question is the fund manager managing collective investment scheme CIS with investment discretions? Second question is, which consists of 2 parts. The first part would be, are climate-related risks relevant to the fund? And if the answer is yes, then we can actually move on to the second part of the question, which is, are climate-related risks material to the fund? And in the situations where climate-related risks are actually considered to be irrelevant, or if it's relevant but immaterial, then we can skip the third question and move on to the fourth one. But if under the situation where climate-related risks are considered relevant and material, then we can move on to the third question, which is the fund manager a large fund manager? That is, if they pass the AUM Hong Kong $8 billion threshold. And of course, the fourth question is for assessing whether they are also applicable to the disclosure requirement, which is the fund manager responsible for the overall operation of the fund, ROOF? So let us move on to see how we can actually apply these 4 questions in determining the applicability of the requirements. But before I begin, I would like to actually explain a bit further in relation to question 1, which is whether the fund manager is managing collective investment scheme with investment discretions. Actually, during our consultations, we have received a number of inquiries from our licensed corporations on whether the requirements would be applicable to them under situations, first of all, where the investment discretions were actually delegated from another party, for example, their group entity, or the second scenario would be where the licensed corporation have further delegated their investment discretions out to a third party. So in this regard, I would like to explain further using the following flowchart. So when determining the applicability of the requirements, fund managers should first consider whether they have discretions over the investment management process. And if so, the SFC requirements are applicable to the extent of the fund manager's role. So for example, when the licensed corporation have only been delegated with investment discretions, again, for example, from the group entity, to manage a portion of the collective investment scheme fund, then the requirements will only be applicable to such portion of the fund. And generally speaking, fund managers should apply the principle of proportionality. That is, they should assess their nature, size, complexity, and risk profile of the firms and the investment strategy adopted by each fund under their manage in determining how to adhere with the requirements accordingly. And we would like to also highlight that the principle of proportionality is actually an existing requirements under the FMCC paragraph 1.2 subsection D. Separately, if a licensed corporation is solely providing investment advice to a separate team of an affiliate, again, I would like to highlight is to a separate team of an affiliate, or acting as a distributor of a fund with no investment management discretions, then the licensed corporations will not be expected to comply with the SFC climate-related risk requirements at this point in time. And then on the other hand, of course, the second scenario that I mentioned is where the fund manager delegated the investment management function to a sub-manager, then they should retain the overall responsibility for complying with the SFC climate requirements. We would like our licensed corporation to note that this is actually an existing requirement under paragraph 1.10 of the Fund Manager Code of Conduct, which I would like to highlight that, I quote, where functions are delegated to third parties, there should be ongoing monitoring for the competence of delegates to ensure that the principle of FMCC are followed. Although the investment management role of the fund manager may be subcontracted, the responsibility and obligations of the fund manager to the funds it manages may not be delegated. Now that we are more clear about the scope of the requirements, we'll then apply the 4 questions that I mentioned earlier in the next couple of slides and see how they actually work in practice in determining the applicability under 4 different scenarios. And for these scenarios, we will assume that licensed corporations is indeed managing collective investment schemes with investment discretions, which means the answers to questions 1 will always be yes. So the first scenarios, of course, question 1 is yes. Then we can actually move on to question 2, part 1. Are climate-related risks relevant to the fund? And in this scenario, the answer is no. And we do understand that there are situations where fund managers may assess that climate-related risks are irrelevant to its investment and risk management processes owing to the nature of the fund's investments or strategy. For example, if it's a quantitative fund, or because of the time horizon of the investment, for example, if they're doing day trading. And therefore, in this scenario, if climate-related risk is considered irrelevant, then all the fund managers need to do is to periodically assess if climate-related risk will become relevant at a later stage. So again, we can actually skip the third questions as climate-related risks are not irrelevant to the fund. And then we can move on to the 4th question to determine the disclosure requirement if it's applicable. And the question is the fund manager is considered as a ROOF responsible for overall operation of the fund? And if the answer is yes, since climate-related risks have been assessed to be irrelevant to certain type of investment strategies or fund under managed, then the fund manager will be expected to disclose such exception at the entity level or at the fund level. So second scenario, again, answer to question 1 is yes, fund managers is managing CIS with investment discretions. And second question, part 1. In this case, climate-related risks are indeed relevant. So we move on to the second part is, are climate-related risks material to the fund? And in this scenario, it is actually not material to the fund. So in this case, we would expect the fund manager to comply with the governance requirement. And for the investment and risk management, the fund manager will need to periodically assess if climate-related risks will become relevant and material to the fund at later stage. Again, we can actually skip the 3rd question and go to the 4th question for the disclosures. In this scenario, the fund manager is a ROOF. Then what they need to do is to disclose how they have been complying with the governance requirement and what kind of process the fund manager have adopted to identify and determine relevant and material climate-related risk. So the first scenario now, again, first question is yes, fund manager is managing collective investment scheme with investment discretions. Second question, part 1 and 2, in this case, both yes. So climate-related risks are indeed relevant and also material to the fund. And because of that, we can actually move on to the 3rd question, which is the fund manager also considered as a large fund manager? That is, they're managing with an asset under managed over the Hong Kong $8 billion threshold for any 3 months in the previous reporting year. For this scenario, the answer is no. Then the fund manager will only need to comply with the baseline requirement on governance, investment management, and risk management. And move on to the 4th question. In this case, also the fund manager is a ROOF. then what they need to do is to disclose how they have been complied with the baseline requirements on governance, investment management, and risk management requirements accordingly.
So Winnie, what if a fund manager has been delegated with investment discretion, but the risk management function is performed by its head office or other affiliated companies of the group? Is the fund manager still required to adhere with the governance, investment management, and risk management requirements?
Yeah, Linda, as a matter of fact, under these circumstances, the Hong Kong licensed corporations will only need to adhere with the governance and investment management requirements, but no need to adhere with the risk management requirements. And just to highlight to our licensed corporations, we have actually clarified such expectations under the answer to question 1 of the climate requirements FAQ. So they can take note and refer to that answers for further details. So now we can move on to our 4th scenarios. Again, the first question is yes. So fund manager is managing CIS with investment discretions. Second question, part 1 and 2, also yes. So climate-related risks are relevant and also material to the fund. So we can move on to the 3rd question. In this scenario, the answer is also yes. The fund manager actually passed the $8 billion threshold, so they are actually considered as a large fund managers. That means the large fund manager will need to comply with both the baseline requirement and also the enhanced standards, including as part of the enhanced standards to, first of all, assess the relevance and utility of scenario analysis in evaluating the resilience of investment strategies to climate-related risk under different pathway. If the assessment result is deemed to be relevant and useful, then the fund manager are required to develop a plan to implement scenario analysis within a reasonable time frame. And second of all, is the large fund managers need to take reasonable steps to identify portfolio carbon footprint of scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions associated with the fund's underlying investments. So now we can move on to the 4th questions, again, in relation to the applicability of the disclosures. That is, if the large fund manager is also a ROOF. In this case, if the answer is yes, then the large fund manager will need to disclose how they have been complied with the baseline and also the enhanced standards on governance, investment management, risk management, and also the expectations on describing the engagement policy with illustrative examples, and also disclosing the portfolio carbon footprints of scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions that they have calculated. And they also need to indicate the calculation methodology, underlying assumptions and limitations, and also the proportion of investments, and that is in terms of the net asset value of the fund, which are being assessed or covered. So lastly, let us move on to the implementation timeline. For our licensed corporations, what I would recommend that they can remember actually 2 numbers, which is 12 and 15. So what that 2 number means is that we are first of all providing 12 months transition period for our large fund managers to comply with the baseline requirement. That is, the effective date will be August 20th, 2022. And for 15, what that means is that we are providing 15 months transition period for other in-scope fund managers to comply with the baseline requirement. That means the effective date will be November 20th, 2022. And we are also providing a 15-month transition period for large fund managers to comply with the enhanced standards, except in relation to the disclosures for portfolio carbon footprints metrics. For such disclosure requirement, large fund managers will need to observe their fund's financial year-end date. For funds with a financial year-end date after the effective date of the enhanced standards on November 20th, 2022, large fund managers are required to disclose to fund investors the portfolio carbon footprints calculated based on the positions as of their financial year-end. And the disclosure of these metrics should be made through an appropriate channel no later than the usual date of the fund's audited accounts or annual reports, which is usually between 3 and 6 months after the financial year end. And large fund managers can choose to disclose the portfolio carbon footprint for funds in a more frequent manner, and they can also supplement the portfolio carbon footprint metrics with additional metrics as they deem appropriate. And as you can see from this slide, we also recognize that some of our licensed fund managers are also actually managing European Union, the undertakings for collective investments in transferable securities, which is the UCITS funds. And they will need to also comply with the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure requirements. The Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which is the SFDR requirements. Therefore, we have ensured that the implementation timeline for the portfolio carbon footprint disclosure requirements is compatible with the EU SFDR Level 2 disclosure requirements as illustrated in this slide.
Thanks, Winnie. In the four scenarios, we have mentioned quite often the terms relevance and materiality. So, Kelvin, can you explain how fund managers can assess relevance and materiality of climate-related risks?
Yeah, sure. First, let me briefly explain what are climate-related risks and how climate-related risks affect the value of investment in a fund. Climate-related risks can be categorized into physical risk and transition risk. Physical risk refer to impact to the financial position of a company or value of an asset caused by extreme weather events and progressive longer-term shift in the climate patterns. Acute physical risks such as direct damage to property and assets caused by cyclones and floods, or operation disruption due to transportation difficulties that results in the reduction in productivity and revenue. Chronic physical risks such as change in rainfall or extreme weather patterns, rising in average temperature and sea levels will also affect different industries. For example, if you reduce the revenue and higher costs from negative impact on workforce, for example, because of safety reason or reduced working day due to extreme weather. It also causes layoffs or early retirement of existing assets, such as farms no longer suitable for agriculture or places no longer suitable for habitation, and the migration of population causes properties or assets in that area become abandoned. Increased operating costs as a result to obtain water or resources from a longer distance. Transition risk refer to risk associated with the ongoing viability of a business as the high carbon economy transitions to a low carbon economy. For example, it could be changes in government policies that affect the profitability of a company, like increase in price of GHG emission to meet the net zero target, or mandates for or regulations of existing products and services, such as requirements to improve the energy efficiency or increase in the ratio of renewable energy during production. Substitution of existing products and services with lower emission options, such as the replacement of petroleum cars with electricity cars. All of these will increase the operating costs, such as expenditure for research and development, costs to adopt or deploy new practice and processes, or write-offs or early retirement of existing assets. Besides, the change of customer preference also reduces demand for carbon-intensive goods and services and affect the revenue of a company. Physical or transition risk may trigger liability risks, such which fund managers should also take into consideration in the risk assessment processes. In addition, climate-related risks may have implications for other financial risks, such as credit, market, and liquidity risks. For example, decrease in the profitability of a company would affect its repayment ability and results in increase in credit risk. The reduced market demand may also affect the valuation of a company and results in market risk. The physical and transition risk mentioned above more or less will impact the value of a company. Hence, in general, climate-related risks are relevant to investments of funds. However, as Winnie mentioned earlier, in some circumstances, a fund manager may assess that climate-related risks are irrelevant to its investment and risk management processes, only to the nature of a fund's investment or strategy, for example, a comp fund, forest fund, or index futures funds, or due to the time horizon of the investments. For example, it's a day trading funds. Under these circumstances, when the fund manager is ROOF, in making the disclosure, the fund manager should ensure its conclusions are justifiable and maintain appropriate records in explaining why climate-related risks are irrelevant. When identifying climate-related risks, fund managers are encouraged to look beyond their usual investment horizon. Physical and transition risks, which are not likely to have a material impact in short term, may become material in the medium or long term. Fund managers should consider how such risks will affect their strategy and how these risks can be factored into their investment management process if they become material over time. When assessing the materiality of impact of cumulative risk on an investment strategy or a fund managers should adopt an approach which is appropriate and proportionate to their circumstances. The approach can be quantitative, or some combination of both. For example, fund manager can make reference to scientific research, such as the charts of flood risk by geographical locations. If the operation or assets of a company is concentrated in high-risk area, climate-related risk may be a material risk. The material map of SSBIT, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, has identified sustainable issues that are likely to affect the financial condition or operating performance of companies within an industry, including climate and environmental issues, such as GHG emissions. It also indicates the likelihood of material impact of the sustainability issues to different sectors and industries. For example, GHG emissions are regarded to have material impact to the whole mineral extraction and processing sectors, as these sectors consume a large amount of energy. While for food and beverage sectors, GHG emissions are regarded to have material impact to agricultural industry, but less material to reservoirs. If fund managers want to have a deeper understanding on how to assess climate-related risk, they can make reference to the Overview of Environmental Risk Analysis (ERA) published by the NGFS, which provides wide-ranging examples of how to translate environmental risk into financial risk, and a review of the tools and methodology used by the financial institutions for ERA. Fund managers can also refer to the case study of environmental risk analysis for in-depth discussion of the tools and methodology to develop and enhance their own ERAs. You can also make reference to the hyperlinks in the Appendix 2 to our circular. Fund manager can also estimate physical risk based on scientific data, such as frequency of floods and typhoons that estimate damages, or the actual carbon emission of a company for transition risk. Fund managers can further compare the total carbon footprints of a fund against a benchmark and another fund or a peer average to evaluate the climate risk of the underlying portfolio. Fund managers should periodically evaluate the relevancy and materiality of climate-related risk, at least annually, or when there is major change in the investment strategy or asset allocation. So let's move on to talk about the relevant requirements.
Yeah, so just for our license corporation to have a more detailed understanding in terms of the requirements that we just mentioned. So first of all, as you can see from this slide, in regards to the amendments to the Fund Manager Code of Conduct, from the 4 elements perspective, first of all, for governance, we are actually relying on these existing requirements under paragraphs 1.2a to d, and also paragraph 1.6, and also paragraph 1.8. And in terms of investment management, we do have a new paragraph 3.1a. And for risk management, first of all, we are relying on existing paragraph 1.7.1. And also we have amended paragraph 3.11.1b. And we have a new a new paragraph F under Appendix 2 to the Fund Manager Code of Conduct, suggested risk management control techniques and procedures for funds. And for disclosures requirement, we have a new paragraph 6.2a. And as I mentioned earlier, because discretionary account management is actually out of scope for this initial stage, so we also clarified that point under paragraph in appendix to the Fund Manager Code of Conduct under particular requirements in the code which are not applicable to discretionary account managers. And if licensed corporations would like to know further details in terms of what the change in wordings under the code, they can actually refer to our consultation conclusion document for further details. So we can also move on to the expected standards, which are mentioned under our circular that was issued on August 20th this year. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 2 tiers. First is the baseline requirement, and the second tier is the enhanced standards that is cover for all four elements under governance, investment management, risk management, and disclosures. So for the next couple of slides, we can actually move on with and provide our license corporations with further details. So mainly what these expected standards will include. So firstly, in terms of the governance, it mainly include requirements for fund managers to put in place appropriate governance structures to set clear roles and responsibility for the boards and also senior managements in managing climate-related risk. So for the board, we would expect the board or the board committee to exercise oversight on the management of the risk. And also we would require management to set clear goals and action plans, and also have set out internal control policies and procedures for managing climate-related risk. And for investment management, the expected standards would mainly include identify relevant and material climate-related risk, and to factor those assessed to be material climate-related risk into the investment management process. So Kelvin, would you mind move on to the risk management and disclosures requirements?
Sure. Same as investment management, if climate-related risks are relevant and material, fund managers should establish and implement appropriate risk management procedures. Fund managers may consider different approaches in managing climate-related risks. For example, asset reallocations or exercise stewardship through active engagement or use voting to influence the behavior of the investee companies. We understand that for certain reasons, such as investment strategy like index fund or passive funds, or for return considerations, a fund may need to invest in high climate-related risk companies. In such cases, engagement becomes more important in risk management. Fund managers can pay attention to the investee company's carbon footprint and see how they handle cases of high carbon emissions, or do they have any carbon emission reduction plan. Fund managers can also show active engagement to improve the sustainability of the investee companies and sharpen the positive corporate behavior. For example, request the company to develop policies for handling the climate-related risks inherent in their business, which means through climate mitigation or climate adaptation. Shareholders' proposals on ESG issues have increased in recent years, such as requiring listed companies to enhance their ESG disclosure or to include ESG issues in the management's oversight. Fund managers can also exercise their proxy voting rights to influence the corporate approach on climate change. Some common examples would be the veto of appointment of board members which are reluctant to address climate change matters. In fact, fund managers play an important role in influencing investee companies' actions and improving the quality of climate-related disclosures. Given that fund managers have their own strategies and limitations, the SFC is mindful to allow fund managers the flexibility to develop their engagement policies. While large fund managers are required to disclose their engagement policies to investors, they have the discretion to determine their level of engagement having regard to the circumstances of each case. For example, if a fund manager only invests through derivative to gain exposure or only hold a very small position in an investee company, it may not be feasible for them to conduct active engagement. Fund managers may consider to state these limitations in their disclosure to investors for investors to have a better understanding of their engagement policy. One point to look at is the requirements for the management of climate-related risks should not prohibit or restrict a fund manager from complying with applicable laws and discharging its fiduciary duties and other legal obligations in other jurisdictions. Tools and measures. We have just mentioned different tools and measures to assess climate-related risk. Fund managers are also required to apply appropriate tools and measures to assess and quantify climate-related risks. Among these indicators, GHG emissions data is the most common measures used by the industry to assess the impact of an investment of the transitions to a low-carbon economy. A number of global fund managers have adopted GHG emissions data as a matrix to monitor climate-related risk in their underlying portfolios and report it in their corporate publications. At this initial stage, when climate-related risks are assessed to be material, the SFC required large fund managers to make reasonable efforts to acquire or estimate the Scope 1 and Scope 2 GHG emissions of funds and calculate the fund's portfolio carbon footprint. Define its calculation methodology and underlying assumptions. On the other hand, as climate-related risks are forward-looking in nature, it may be hard to assess them using standard risk modeling based on historical data. Scenario analysis could help fund managers assess how portfolio may be affected by risk and opportunity arising from climate change and evaluate the resilience of investment strategies to climate-related risk under different pathways. Data limitations should not hinder the industry's efforts to begin building capacity, and this is in line with the regulatory approaches in other jurisdictions. Therefore, large fund managers are required to assess the relevancy and utility of scenario analysis in evaluating the resilience of investment strategies to climate-related risks under different pathways, and to keep records of these assessments. If climate scenario analysis is assessed to be relevant and useful, large fund managers should plan to develop and implement scenario analysis which is commensurate with their size and nature of their business within a reasonable time frame. Large fund managers may make reference to climate scenario and scenario data provided by the NGFS and other organizations. The scenario portal of NGFS has published a common framework for climate scenario analysis, which provides step-by-step guidance. It also provides 3 representative scenarios which can be used to explore the economic impact and financial risk of climate change under an orderly or disorderly manner to meet the Paris Agreement's target of net zero emissions. And it also includes a hothouse world scenario with significant global warming. NGFS also provides the macroeconomic data necessary for scenario analysis, such as CO2 emissions, carbon price, GDP impact, and energy mix to facilitate scenario analysis by fund managers. There are other institutions that provide different scenarios for reference, such as IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and International Energy Agency. As Winnie mentioned earlier, if you are a fund manager with ROOF, you are required to make climate-related risk disclosure, which include the governance structure on climate-related risk oversight, the roles and responsibility of the board and the management, as well as how climate-related risks are taken into consideration in the investment and risk management processes. Enhanced standards include the disclosure of the engagement policy and also the fund's portfolio carbon footprint of Scope 1 and Scope 2 GHG emissions. It's to clarify that disclosure of investment and risk management process is only applicable when the climate-related risks are assessed to be relevant and material. Otherwise, the fund manager only required to disclose funds or strategies that are assessed to be irrelevant, or the process are adopted to identify and determine relevant and material risks.
Kelvin, some licensed corporations have asked whether they can rely on their group entities' ESG disclosures rather than making their own disclosures. So could you explain to the audience about our expectations?
Yeah. If a fund manager, after internal assessment, confirms that group-wide policies and procedures are applied consistently in its operation in Hong Kong, and they also meet or exceed the SFC's requirements, it's acceptable for the fund manager to adopt its group disclosure and provide it to the investors. However, if the local adoption deviates from the group policies, procedures of disclosures, the fund manager should supplement the group disclosure with additional information at the local level. Furthermore, if some policy or process applied consistently across different strategies and funds, fund manager can disclose can make disclosure at the entity level to reduce the compliance burden. Fund managers may also disclose at the fund level is more appropriate. The SFC considered that disclosure can be made via various channels such as website, newsletters, or report to investor, as long as investors' attention is drawn to the information. However, fund managers should observe the following when making the disclosure. They should adopt a proportionate approach. That means the information disclosed should be proportionate to the degree climate risks are considered in the investment and risk management processes without overemphasis on it. It should also make this adequate disclosure of information in writing and communicate to fund investors through electronic or other means, such as the company website. And review the disclosures at least annually. Update the disclosure when considered appropriate and also inform the fund investor of any material changes as soon as practicable. The principle for disclosure should be clear, accurate, and facilitate clients' understanding. Fund managers can, based on their situation, to decide the format of the disclosures.
Well, we have requested the large fund managers to assess and disclose the portfolio carbon footprint to investors so as to provide them with a quality and comparable matrix. So, Kelvin, in practice, what does this matrix mean?
Yeah. First, let's understand what are Scope 1 and Scope 2 carbon GHG emissions. GHG emissions are divided into 3 categories. Scope 1 refers to all direct GHG emissions, such as fuel used for vehicles or for production. Scope 2 refers to indirect GHG emissions from the consumption of purchased electricity, heat, or steam. Scope 3 refers to other indirect emissions that occur in the reporting company's value chain, include both upstream and downstream, such as emissions related to the extraction and production of the purchased materials. As a starting point, we focus on Scope 1 and Scope 2 GHG emissions disclosure, as investee companies may not have necessary primary emission data from their suppliers, or there is a lack of commonly adopted estimation model at this stage. However, with the improvement in emission disclosure and calculation methodologies in the future, we will reconsider requiring the disclosure of all the 3 scopes of GHG emissions. Now, let me use an example to illustrate how to calculate the carbon emission of a listed company. Company A is a metal extraction and production company, which consumes a lot of energy during the production process and mainly uses fossil fuel as its energy source. Its Scope 1 and Scope 2 GHG emissions are around 90 million tons per year. It has a market capitalization of 70 billion and a total debt of 150 billion. For a listed company, enterprise value means the sum of the market capitalization of ordinary and preferred shares and also the book value of total debt. Therefore, company A has an enterprise value of 220 billion. Divide its carbon emissions with the enterprise value. We can get that for each 1 million Hong Kong dollar invested in company A, the carbon footprint is 409 tons of CO2 equivalent. Company B is a retail company, which the main source of GHG emissions is electricity used by its retail stores. The Scope 1 and Scope 2 GHG emissions are much lower, which is around 12,000 tons per year. It has a market capitalization of 4 billion and total debt of 1 billion, representing an enterprise value of 5 billion. Therefore, for each 1 million invested in company B, the carbon footprint is 2.4 tons CO2 equivalent. For other asset classes, fund manager can make reference to the PCAF standards to calculate the respective carbon footprint, such as in relation to mortgage loan or real estate. After we obtain the per million carbon emissions of each investment, adding back the value of each investment and the total value of the portfolio, fund managers then will get the portfolio carbon footprint of the fund, which means the carbon emission per $1 million invested. Currently, the carbon price in EU emission trading system is between 30 and 60 euros per ton. It's generally expected that the carbon price will rise to over $100 by 2050, which is equivalent to around 1,000 Hong Kong dollars per ton. If both companies in the examples have not taken any action to reduce their GHG emissions, fund managers can assess how such emissions will affect the company's cost and profit, and how it in turn will impact the company's value. If a fund is composed of more carbon-intensive companies like Company A, then the carbon portfolio footprint of the fund will be higher and generally subject to higher climate-related risks. This can provide some information to investors about the climate-related risk of a portfolio.
So, Kelvin, let's also explain to the audience why we require the large fund managers to assess and disclose portfolio carbon footprint among various metrics.
Yeah. A common data is crucial for investors to compare different funds and make informed investment decisions. TCFD recommendation released in June 2017 lists a number of GHG emissions and exposure matrices which are being widely referred by the industry. In its 2020 status report, the TCFD analyzed disclosure made by the PLR signatories and noted that portfolio carbon footprint was the most commonly disclosed matrix. And in its latest consultation paper, asset managers are also recommended to disclose financed emissions matrix based on PCAF's methodology. And also in the course of our consultation, we also received suggestions from the public to make reference to the PCAF standards for making disclosures. So, to facilitate comparison of investors, large fund managers are required to make reference to the PCAF standard to calculate the portfolio carbon footprint and disclose such information. We believe this change, together with the higher threshold for large fund managers and alignment with the disclosure requirement under the EU's SFDR, should have the least impact on the industry while providing a comparable matrix for stakeholders' information. The SFC also acknowledged that calculation of GHG emissions for a number of asset classes, such as derivatives, sovereign debts, and short positions, are still under development and not of a widely acceptable approach. Our current approach has provided adequate flexibility for large fund managers to deal with such situations by allowing them to state their methodologies, limitations, and also the coverage of disclosure to comply with the new requirements. The baseline requirements and enhanced standards of disclosure are required to be followed after the transition period, as mentioned by Winnie previously. And also, the portfolio carbon footprint should be made based on the fund's financial year-end position for after November 20th of 2022, as described by Winnie.
Thanks, Kelvin and Winnie, for explaining our requirements. There are a few more questions and matters that we would like to share our views with our audience. So the first question will be about the umbrella funds. So Winnie, if a licensed corporation is an investment manager of an umbrella fund, but it has delegated its investment management functions to its group companies for the sub-funds, so is the fund manager still required to fulfill the requirements under the FMCC? And also in assessing whether this LC is a large fund managers, so should firm include the AUM of these all these sub-funds? And further, in assessing the relevance and materiality of the climate-related risk, should the LC perform the assessment at the umbrella fund level or at the sub-fund levels?
Yeah, so generally speaking, we should actually take a step back and consider determining the applicability of fund manager code of conduct requirements when a SFC licensed fund managers is actually delegated further its investment discretions or any other functions to a third party. So the key, again, is we would suggest our licensed corporations to refer to paragraph 1.10 of our fund manager code of conduct. And again, here I would like to quote what that paragraph actually mentioned, is where functions are delegated to third parties, there should be ongoing monitoring of the competence of delegates to ensure that the principle of this code are followed. Although the investment management role of the fund manager may be subcontracted, the responsibility and obligations of the fund manager to the fund it manages may not be delegated. So therefore, in brief, although the investment discretions may have been delegated out to a third party, the responsibility still actually lies with the SFC licensed fund manager to ensure that the compliance with the fund manager code of conduct's climate-related risk requirements are still being adhered to. And the same principle should actually apply when determining the threshold of the $8 billion, whether the fund managers is actually a large fund managers. So the fund manager should actually take into account of all collective investment scheme funds as under managed that it has investment discretions over, which include accounting for those that the investment discretions have been further delegated out to a third party. So the second question is whether the assessments of the climate-related risk should actually be made at the umbrella fund level, or should it actually be made at the sub-fund level, because there might be different investment strategies being adopted under the sub-fund level. And in this regard, what our view is that rather than prescribing on the approach, we would actually provide flexibility to the fund managers to determine which would be the most appropriate approach to assess and manage the risk of each fund or sub-fund being managed. But we would recommend our fund managers to consider factors such as the nature of the investments of each sub-fund. So if it's whether it's actually same investment, same nature, or if it's actually different nature of the investments.
So thank you, Winnie. The next questions will be about the materiality assessment. So Kelvin, how do fund managers assess the materiality of the climate risk? So should this be based on the overall strategy of the fund, like whether the fund is an ESG fund or not, or it should be based on the individual security or the issuer level?
Yeah, thanks. And as the FMCC requirements apply to all fund managers for the funds they manage, as a source of risk, climate-related risk is also applied to all funds managed by the fund managers, no matter it's an ESG fund or a non-ESG focused fund. So when assessing the materiality of climate-related risk, fund managers should start with at the individual investment level. For example, they should assess how the climate-related risk impact each investment and then aggregate the impacts of all the investments. If a fund or a strategy did not invest or only invest in a very small portion of its assets to these high climate-related risk investments, then the fund manager may conclude that climate-related risk may not be material to the fund or the strategies. However, if a fund invests a considerable amount or will invest a considerable amount of their investment in these high carbon intensive companies, then climate-related risk may be material to the funds or the strategies. And the fund managers should implement appropriate measures to manage and implement the climate-related risk into its investment and risk management process.
So Kelvin, but how about in the case of a fund manager, if it's not able to collect any data about the carbon footprint, so how does this assess the relevance and materiality of the climate-related risk?
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, when a fund manager assesses the climate-related risk, it can be used a different approach, for example, by the qualitative, quantitative, or a combination of both. GHG emission is only one of the indicators to assess the materiality of climate-related risk. So for large fund managers, when climate-related risks are assessed to be relevant and material, they are required to assess and disclose the Scope 1 and Scope 2 GHG emissions associated with the fund's underlying investment. We understand that GHG emission data may not be available for certain investment at this stage, such as private company or listed company in emerging markets. Fund managers may engage the firms directly to obtain such data or make use of the official statistics or other data provided by the other services provided to estimate the carbon emissions. For example, PCAF also provide a number of options for reference in estimating the GHG emissions of a company based on the productivity or the industry average ratio. Nevertheless, if the data is unavailable after the large fund manager have exercised reasonable efforts, Fund managers should disclose such limitation and the coverage of the portfolio carbon footprint in the disclosure. For example, such as how much the NAV is covered by the disclosure.
So thank you, Kelvin. Another question that may be relevant to our licensed corporations is about the documentary evidence. Many of them are interested to know what evidence is expected to be maintained to demonstrate their compliance with the requirements. So Winnie, can you share our expected standards with our audience?
Certainly. So as we mentioned previously, of course, climate-related risk is actually a source of financial risk as well. So same as any other investment risk, such as market risk, liquidity risk, or counterparty risk. And for our new requirements, we're not trying to single out climate-related risk. So we would actually suggest our fund managers to use the same approach as what they did in complying with the other FMCC requirements in terms of maintaining documentation and evidence, and use the same practice for adhering with the climate-related risk requirements to demonstrate that they have properly identified, measured, managed, and monitored the climate-related risks of the funds. And some might actually also ask, so how about making the disclosures if they are actually considered as a ROF? So what kind of manner should they actually use to make the disclosures? So in this case, we will actually recommend our fund managers to make reference to paragraph 22 of the circular that we've issued on August 20th this year, which we have provided further details on what our expected standards on the manners of disclosure is going to be. So just to give you some example is, for example, is making adequate disclosures of information in writing, or they should review disclosures at least annually when they're making the disclosures to the investors.
Thank you, Winnie. So I think it comes to the end of the seminar. But the end of this seminar is just the beginning of your actions. Fund managers have to demonstrate their capabilities to align with the requirements and to get yourself familiarized with the requirements and start the preparatory work for implementing the requirements. So you can refer to our circular for the list of examples of the different practices and a list of reference materials on also the expected requirements. And if you have any questions, just feel free to contact us or your case officers. Again, thank you for attending the seminar today. Goodbye.
Bye.